Yeah, we've had people stuck on a train. We've had all sorts. Yeah. Hello, everybody on UK Crime Bookland. I'm here to talk with Mary about so the inheritance of Solomon Farthing and talk about Remembrance Sunday as well.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. If you could start by telling us about the plot, then please, Mary.
Okay, so The Inheritance of Solomon Farthing is a sort of detective story that follows a contemporary narrative and a historical narrative. And the contemporary narrative is about a man who's an heir hunter, and he basically chases the estates of people who've died without a will. And he gets involved in the case of an old soldier who's died with no apparent next of kin in contemporary Edinburgh. And so Solomon Farthing, which is the name of the title, he's the name of my heir hunter. He goes on a journey really to try and see if he can find a living relative of this old soldier who's died. And what happens then in the book is we start with Solomon, but then we jump back into the past and we meet this group of men who are at the very end of the First World War in 1918. And really, the book is about the question of how Solomon and the money that he's trying to find a home for is connected with this group of soldiers who are together at the very end of the First World War.
So, as we're on Remembrance Sunday, the first thing is, how did you get it so accurate to cover the war period in that section?
Well, oh, thank you very much for saying that it feels accurate. I think when I set out to write the book, I wanted to write about money and how money passes hands. And I hadn't anticipated writing a sort of First World War narrative, except then when I was thinking about where in history the element of the past was set, I just had this vision of this group of men standing around, and they were holding rifles, and that there was a dead man at their feet. And I knew the question in the book was who was the dead man, and what had happened, and who had shot him, and why. And I realised as well that I just had in my head that this was First World War. There was something, I have quite a visual sort of writing style, and I just could see them in this small grove of trees, and I just thought, this is First World War. And I was sort of, have to say, I was quite horrified by that idea, because of course there's so much written about the First World War, isn't there? I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful fiction, poetry, non-fiction. I mean, you can't really sort of write anything new in a way. And so I was a bit paralyzed by that when I realized they were in at the very end of the First World War. And then what I did was I tried to think of them just as contemporaries, not contemporaries as in 2016, which is when I set the book, but contemporaries of their time. So they didn't know that they were in history as far as we're concerned. I just thought this is a group of young men and a few older men. And really, it's a question of how they feel and the situation they're in at the time and how would they deal with it. The fact that it's an extreme situation, a war situation, is just the world they're in. So I tried not to lay our sort of ideas, our archetypal ideas of mud and wire and going over the top onto it. And I actually removed them from the kind of trenches scenario, because it's the very end of the war and they're sort of a group who've become separated from the rest of their company, and they're just sort of waiting, like a lot of men were waiting for the war to end. So it's not like they're in a trench and they're going to have to go over the top or anything like that. But they are in a sort of slightly grey area of the war. We all know, of course, the war is going to end in a few days, and that's the advantage we bring as readers to the book. But they have no idea, and so it was about trying to get into their heads. That's what mattered to me, to try and make it feel authentic. And then afterwards, of course, I did my research. I went to the Imperial War Museum. I went to the Alnwick Castle, where the Northumberland Fusiliers who feature in the book there's a wonderful museum there about what happened in the First World War and other wars. And so I made sure that the sort of detail was correct, but really it's all about character and getting in their heads.
Talking about character, Solomon Farthing and the dual timeline must have been complicated to try and get right.
Yes, it was really tricky. I I did write them as sort of separate narratives. You know, I wrote, although in the book, for those who don't know the book, what happens is you get a section of Solomon doing his investigations into his dead old man in 2016 for about sort of 3 chapters at a time, and then we jump and go into 1918 for 3 chapters at a time. Then we jump back, etc. And so, yeah, what I did was I wrote Solomon all together. I didn't sort of write him, then go to 1918, write him, then go to 1918. I tried to sort of give him a more sort of sense of flow. Then I wrote whole chunks of 1918. And then I have a sort of instinctive sense of where to cut and where to then move back into the present from the past, etc. But it was really, really tricky to get the two to connect up. And of course, you know, Alex, for those who haven't read the book, there is also at the end of each sort of part of the book, and the book has about 5 different parts, there's a catch up in a different time frame with some of the men from 1918. So we have 1971, and we have 1956, and we have 1948, I think, she says, trying to remember her own book.
Yeah.
Going right back to 1921. So, you know, there's quite a lot of moving around, and that really did drive me quite mad in the end.
Yeah. When you were doing that, what was the influence to make you decide to do the plots you did? Because your first book similar as well with lost people community.
Yes, that's right. I wrote a novel called The Other Mrs. Walker. In fact, I've got a little copy of her here. Here she is for
Yeah.
you to see.
Yeah.
And that again, yes, that was a book about the world of people who die with no apparent next of kin. And I had been interested in that subject for really quite a long time. And I'd gone off and written a whole nother novel about something completely different, which was like a lot of first time novelists, novels never published, thankfully, and never will be. And I wanted to write, but I couldn't get out of my head this program I'd seen years ago on television about people who went into the homes of someone who's died with no apparent next of kin, and they kind of do a detective job basically to try and see if they can find any clues as to who the person absolutely is, and any try and track down next of kin. And I remember being absolutely fascinated by this. And for many years, I sort of sat in the back of my head. And then when I came to write what became The Other Mrs. Walker, I thought, well, I'm going to write about this kind of detective job that somebody has to do. And then what happened was, when I was writing it, I realized I was as much interested in the person who's died and their backstory and their history as I was in the sort of day-to-day thing you have to do to try and track down next of kin. And so that's when I started to add historical narrative to the book. So they're sort of hybrid detective historical narratives. But yes, when I was done with The Other Mrs. Walker, I realized I wasn't sort of done with that world, if you like. And it's a world that goes on in all towns and cities all over the country, and sort of every day, this sort of dealing with people who've died alone in their property, or in hospital, or in a nursing home, and you're like, well, where's their next of kin? There's none. And there's various people who play in that field, who deal with us if we end up in that situation. And Mrs. Walker was about who had to organise your funeral, and who had to sort of get your death certificate signed off with your identity confirmed and get you to your funeral. And Solomon Farthing is about air hunters and people who chase your money if you leave any money behind.
So when you were watching TV program, I'm assuming it might be BBC's Air Hunters, because that was massive in the 90s.
Yes, that's called, see, when you're a novelist, that's called research, right?
Yeah.
Watching daytime telly.
Yeah. When you saw how far they went back with some of the stories, were you ever tempted to write about somewhere in Australia with foundlings or anything, or is that something in the future?
It is really tempting. I mean, I think for me, I tend to definitely overcomplicate my plots, I think. And my editor's always trying to get me to sort of slim it down somewhat, slim it down, which seems incredible if you read my books, but you know, they were sort of even more
Yeah,
complicated before their final version. Yes, the thing about being interested in genealogy or your family history, which I think is really my sort of core of what I'm interested in, and then air hunters on top of that and the job they do, is you can go anywhere. I mean, when I did my research, I met some air hunters. They tend not to call themselves air hunters. They call themselves probate asset researchers, generally speaking,
yeah,
um, because it sounds sort of, I don't know, more proper or more professional maybe. Um, and the air hunters I met, one was a sort of genealogist. That's how she'd started out, and she was a one-woman band, and she would come up to Register's House in Edinburgh, and she would pick certain cases on the list. Basically, the Crown Office publish a list in England, Scotland, all over the UK, that tells you what estates are outstanding and haven't been claimed. And so she would pick the cases that were not the richest and not the simplest, but were somewhere in between, because she was just one person chasing family history, which had really got her started. But the other air hunter I met ran one of the big firms, Finders International, and he
yeah.
quite regularly and his team quite regularly feature on BBC Air Hunters, and they pursue cases all over the place. He was telling me one about which had gone back to the Russian Revolution when I met him. Um, and somebody with an estate that seemed to go back to sort of multiple layers of a family 100 years ago. Um, and they have an office in Edinburgh as well. And I met his air hunter who's based in Edinburgh, and she came across an incredible case about a woman who died a few years ago in Inverness, I think, or certainly up in the north of Scotland. And when they pursued the case, it turned out that she appeared to have died before, back in the 1980s. And that
Wow,
was because basically the air hunters' research proved that she had faked her own death. By appearing to
wow,
jump off a ferry in the channel. And actually what she'd done is she'd gone and started a new life. So
amazing. Yeah,
that's a novel in itself, isn't it? I mean, I
it
was
is
tempted when I heard that to write the
definitely.
novel of that, but I was halfway through Solomon Varthing and I thought, no, one at a time, one at a time.
Yeah. So, given that you just said that might be tempted to write two at once, I know several people do. Have you ever done that?
I have never done that. I have to say, I have great admiration for people who can sort of keep two different worlds going at the same time, by which I mean two separate books. I mean, I keep two worlds going in my head when I write my books because I have a historical world and a contemporary world. But the whole idea of actually the world of a whole book and having another whole world of a whole book going on at the same time, I I haven't been able to do that yet. I mean, I'm only Solomon Farthing is my second published novel, and I'm writing a third at the moment, which will come out next year. And part of me would like to be able to write more than one thing at once, partly because I think I would quite like to write two quite different types of things. I'd like to write something that's quite crime fiction. In fact, even more crime fiction, more orthodox crime fiction than I'm writing at the moment. And then something that probably isn't crime fiction at all. And I think I just think that life's too short and I better hurry up or I'll run out of time. Maybe that's where the impulse comes from. But I haven't got any proof that I can actually do it yet.
So, what in the orthodox kind of fiction appeals to you, and who would be your influences on that?
That's a good question. I think the books I'm writing at the moment, of which there'll definitely be three and possibly a fourth, are about a world. Like I said, they're all set in Edinburgh. Edinburgh's sort of a character in the novel in its own right, and it's this world of people who die no next of kin and a sort of detective job around that. So they're not traditional crime novels in the sense of a crime series where you have one central character who you follow from book to book. And I think I am quite tempted by the idea of writing a more traditional series, by which I mean traditional because you follow one character from book to book. I think if I was going to do that, I would still possibly wear a kind of historical hat and maybe follow them through time. So perhaps it's the kind of causes or issues that they're interested in that change and shift over time, which is just something that I'm already interested in and already write about. So, for example, in Solomon Farthing, this question of shame and what's shameful behaviour, or even the question of criminal behaviour, something that happens in the book, which I won't give away, can be regarded differently over time, basically, and cultures change and shift, and people's idea of what's right and wrong change and shift. So I would still be interested in that, I think. In terms of inspiration, I mean, I grew up as a crime writer reading people like Val McDermid. I read all her Lindsay Gordon books back in the 90s, and absolutely loved those kind of private detective type series, basically. So I've read all the Rebus books, Ian Rankin's novels, of course, which, I mean, if you live in Edinburgh and write about Edinburgh, you have to read those, I think. Yeah. So I'm a massive fan of Kate Atkinson's Jackson Brodie series. Yeah. So these are my kind of inspirations when it comes to following a character.
So you say Edinburgh's a big character. How would you say you would like to describe it? Because you were a tour guide as well, so.
Yeah, that's right. I used to be a tour, I was a tour guide, not for sort of Edinburgh and the place, but I was a tour guide in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, which is just up the road from where I live. And so, yes, this idea of engaging with Scottish history, for example, and Edinburgh history through something like the Portrait Gallery was a fantastic job. I really loved it. I mean, for example, they have plaster casts called phrenology heads, which are made from life, or more interestingly, from my point of view, from death. So they have Burke and Hare in there. Burke, of course, was hanged, and Hare turned king's evidence. And so they have Burke after he was hanged, and you can practically see the sort of mark of the rope on the neck. Yeah. And so, and then upstairs they have little etchings which were made in the sort of early 1800s, late 1700s in Edinburgh, and one of them shows Deacon Brodie, who was the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. And it was made when he was still alive, and he was in jail awaiting his fate for having broken into the tax office, basically, and got caught. And it shows him in prison, and you think that's been done from life. And so as a tour guide, I really love that idea of being able to literally, I wasn't allowed to touch, but it feels like touching history and then talking to people about it. And so, of course, if you live in Edinburgh, I mean, that is Edinburgh all over. You just have to go outside and touch a wall, or walk down a little close in the city centre, and you're literally walking through history, and history that people have written about over time, have talked about over time, have imagined in their heads over time. And so when I was thinking about Mrs. Walker and Solomon Farthing and where I was going to set these novels, I knew it had to be somewhere that, felt important to me. And I thought, I'm going to root it in Edinburgh. And I'm not an Edinburgh native. I've lived in Edinburgh for about 30 years, but I'm not from here. And so from that point of view, I also wanted to give a slight outsider's view of the city.
Yeah. At what point during the tour guide thing did you decide that you'd become a writer, or has that always been a thing?
No, it hasn't always been a thing. It was a thing for a very long time. I mean, it took me a good 15 years before, from sort of going, oh, I'd quite like to be a writer, to actually getting my novel published. So for any writers out there who are writing away and haven't been published and would like to be published, keep going. That's all I can say. No, I started out doing an evening class in like 20 years ago now, and it was called Write That Story! Exclamation mark, which has come good 20 years later. And I just started out doing sort of little bits and pieces, and that course was really good. It was because over the course of a year, I actually did write some stories from beginning to end. And at that time, I just couldn't even imagine myself finishing a short story. So I started like that, and over the years, I built it up. I became a tour guide because in my sort of journey towards being published as a writer, I had done a creative writing degree. And after I had done that, I basically had another job. And I kept doing the thing everyone tells you not to do, which is to give up my job and then keep trying to be a writer and then get another job. And tour guiding was one of my kind of interim style jobs when I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? Because I'd given up my proper job. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do now? So I did a bit of tour guiding, I did a bit of teaching, I did little bits and pieces of freelance stuff before I got that wonderful email that says your novel's going to be published.
I read one of you, or heard one of your short stories this morning on Radio 4, The Cleaner. What's it like writing short stories versus longer ones?
Yeah, that's thank you for listening to that. Yeah, I actually haven't written short stories for quite a long time. So that's the first one that I've done for quite a while. I think in common with a lot of writers, when you're starting out, unless you just launch full flow into a novel that sort of works for you first time, often you write short fiction. It seems more achievable, although I personally think it's really difficult to write good short fiction because it's so short and it's so precise. It's like a different art form in a way from writing a novel. I definitely believe that. But however, there are a lot more opportunities to try and sort of build up your sense of a portfolio or your experience, or just have a go at things in the world of writing shorter fiction. And so I think, like a lot of writers, when you're getting going, you do a lot. You can enter competitions, you can try for anthologies online or in hard copy, etc. And so I certainly started off writing short fiction for several years, but I never sort of felt that comfortable in it. I never felt it quite suited me. And once I got into novel writing, I just became obsessed with trying to get my novels to work. But then I was asked by the BBC to write a short story for their sort of series they have featuring short fiction. And I must admit, I sort of slightly panicked and went, oh, what am I going to do? And I thought, I kept the idea in my head of something that I had written about a few years ago, my last published short story, which must be from about 6 or 7 years ago. And I realized there was material there that I hadn't done with, other characters in the world there that I had created. And so I went back to that, and the idea of the cleaner who isn't really a cleaner, or certainly doesn't do any cleaning, or not in the way we understand, sort of seemed to fit with that world. And it's also, the novel I'm writing at the moment features a cleaner. So I think for me to write in a form that I don't normally write in, I have to have a very clear idea. It has to kind of come together and be clear in my mind. Otherwise I get started and then I can't finish it. So yeah, I actually really enjoyed doing it. And so I'm thinking that maybe I'll have a go at another one.
Yeah. Sorry, my assistant's just answering the phone. So.
That's okay.
It's just hanging on.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Get going back to earlier in thing. You mentioned Val and how she's a big influence on you. Of course, she chose you for a list you could tell us about, I think.
Yes, that's right. She chose me last year, I think, for her list of 10 LGBTQI plus writers in the UK who are sort of writing interesting stuff, and you should sort of pay attention to. And it was a really eclectic and fascinating list to be part of. She did it as part of a literature showcase for the National Writers' Centre based in Norwich, and which was quite nice for me because I spent my teenage years living in Norwich, so I feel an affinity with Norwich as well. But yeah, no, that was a real honour, I have to say. I mean, Val is really well known for supporting writers at all stages of their careers, but particularly new writers. And so I felt incredibly honoured to be chosen in this really wonderful, interesting list of people. And of course, it gives you a platform for your stories. And I don't write narratives in my novels that are specifically about LGBTQI plus issues. But Val made an interesting point to me actually when we were talking about it, and she said the thing is you write about people who are slightly on the outside, so square pegs trying to fit into round holes, and people who stand slightly on the edge of history. And she said, of course, for a long time, the history of LGBTQI plus people has been about being either on the edge or feeling on the edge or put on the edge of history. And a lot of work's gone on in the last sort of 10 to 20 years about trying to put LGBT people at the centre of history, of their own history. And I think that's been fantastic. And in a way, that's what this list is about. It's about saying, here are all these writers, whether they're writing specifically around these issues directly, or whether they're just writing the stories that interest them. Let's put them at the centre, at the front of something for a little while. So that was amazing. I mean, Val has just been really fantastic support to me, and I have to pinch myself sometimes because I can still connect back to the young woman I was in my 20s, reading all her novels in the 90s. Just so to then have got a chance to actually meet her, to talk about books with her, which is really fantastic, and then to be picked by her for that list was wonderful honour.
Um, being on that list, you must have seen and spotted some new talent. What would you say you've learned from maybe reading some of those?
Well, I mean, what you learn is how eclectic and how incredibly diverse UK writing is. I'll give you an example. Actually, one of the other people on the list is a Scottish writer called Kirsty Logan, and I know Kirsty from having studied with her quite a few years ago now. And recently, the two of us were asked to go along to a seminar in Germany by the British Council in Germany to celebrate Scottish writing. And so Kirsty and I were there, and Kirsty and I write novels, but she also writes all sorts of short stories and other things too, and quite different in terms of genre, style, character, etc. And we were also there with J.G. Ying, who's a poet, and Maliki Talak, who writes non-fiction, and in fact fiction too. But we were all very different. But three of us also wrote LGBTQI or identified with those labels. And one of the people in the audience asked us about that. They said it's hard to say what is Scottish fiction when all of you are here, and we were like, well, we are Scottish fiction, you know. So being on that list, that's what you learn from being on a list like that, from reading the work of the other people on a list, from being given a kind of umbrella to sit within, is that under the umbrella you are not all the same. You're wildly different, in fact, and yet you can all be embraced under one umbrella too, and that gives people a reason to come and hear you and listen to you and find a readership. And for writers, what you want to do is to reach as many people as possible, to get your work in front of as many people as possible. If they like your work, fantastic. If they go, it's not for you, for me, that's absolutely fine. But what matters is getting it there and going, have a go with it. And so in some way, these umbrellas allow you, with other diverse writers, to be out there on a platform that you might otherwise not have had.
Yeah. When you're going back to the writing and the historical side, when you decided to do that, what would you say is the most difficult thing about choosing that form of the genre?
What I would say first of all is that I didn't pick a genre when I was writing The Other Mrs. Walker. I wrote the story that I wanted to write, and I knew it was a kind of detective style story, and I knew that some of it was set in the past because I wanted to illuminate the character of Mrs. Walker. And the same with Solomon Farthing. I knew I wanted to write about air hunters, and air hunters do a detective style job. And I knew I wanted to write about this group of men who turned out to be in World War One, and I wanted to look at the question of war and trauma and what that means through time if you have that experience when you're a very young person. Because let's face it, some of the men who went were boys, really. I mean, technically they couldn't go to the front until they were 19, until the last year of the war, when they just shipped them off age 18 with two or 3 weeks training, which a couple of the boys in my book are those kind of characters. And of course there was plenty who went and lied about their age, so you had boys as young as 14, 15, some of them went. But so in a way, for me, I didn't go, oh, I'm writing historical fiction, or oh, I'm writing crime fiction. It's only latterly that in a way my publishers said, oh, this is crime fiction and we're going to promote it as such. And I was really happy about that, because I love crime fiction and had been reading plenty of it, and I love historical fiction and been reading plenty of it. And so from that point of view, I was like, great. But what mattered was telling my story rather than worrying about the genre. And I would really encourage, it's important to kind of get a sense of how publishers might understand your work when you're trying to finally put it out there. But when you're writing it, does it really matter? I mean, just write the story that you want to write and worry afterwards if it fits one thing or the other. I think I've been quite lucky in that regard. Mrs. Walker did very well, and she was a bit of a hybrid novel. She's a sort of crimey detective story and a sort of historical narrative at the same time, and that meant she could have fallen. She could have fallen through the crack in the middle. But actually, what happened was she seemed to attract people who like to read across both of those things, and I that's just what I write. This series is this kind of hybrid type fiction, and I quite enjoy that.
You open with Solomon in a jail, and a bit of a strange character. What was the inspiration for Solomon as a character?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about air hunters, and when because I wanted to write about money, I wanted to write about how money passes hands and this question of inheritance, and what actually makes an inheritance. Is money really what it's about, or is it something else? And I knew also I wanted to write about men and boys, so he was always going to be a male air hunter. And so I sort of latched on air hunters as these interesting people who deal in inheritance. But of course, they do it because it's about money for them. What happens is they get a slice. If they can find a relative of the person who's died and can get that relative to sign, they then get commission, essentially, on the estate. And I just thought that's quite interesting idea. And when I sort of looked into it a bit more, I discovered that it was an unregulated industry. And what that means is you have very reputable people on one hand, and completely disreputable people at the other end of the scale. And there are always occasionally court cases about people, genealogists, family history people, air hunters, who've essentially diddled people out of their own inheritance. And then on the other hand, you have people like the firms in BBC Air Hunters who are very reputable. And so for the purposes of fiction, I wanted a character who was a bit of a ducker and a diver. He's kind of old style. He's the sort of man where before digitization, you had to go down to the register office and you had to be the first to find the right ledger, and you had to be the first to find the right name and date of birth or marriage certificate within that correct ledger. And apparently what I've been told is back in the day, they used to have all sorts of tricks to stop other air hunters getting to the ledger first. I mean, they used to like sort of get them and then hide them, or they would post someone at the front door and warn you if another air hunter was coming up, so you could sort of take the book and go off to another part of the building with it, all this kind of stuff. And so he's like that. He doesn't like that you can just sit down and look at a computer and get all the information, which is wonderful for all of us.
Yeah.
But he likes to get out and about on the trail, and so that's what I have him do in the book. And he likes to sort of be a bit dodgy. He owes money as well, so he needs money, and that's in itself is interesting.
When you were doing it, Solomon found the character that was a book researcher. When you were doing the book yourself, did you ever meet anyone like that?
No, well, not to my knowledge. I mean, no, I've never really met someone who was, well, first of all, I don't know that I've ever met someone who was controlled, who really had run out of tether with their debt. You know, you get to that point where you literally go, what am I going to do? And this drives him down a path which he sort of has flirted with anyway, where he'll sort of do anything if he thinks he can make money out of it. So first of all, I had to sort of imagine that scenario. I think I have met people who are quite dogged around genealogy. I certainly did a bit of when I was sort of first writing the book, which is about 3 years ago or so now. I did a bit of family tree work with my own father, which was really interesting because you can find so much out by just Googling nowadays, but actually also you become obsessed with the gaps, with the things you can't find out or not at the touch of a button, and so it does become quite a sort of obsessive hobby. Me and my father did it to a certain extent, and then we sort of stopped. And I think that was because we were getting closer and closer to his generation on the family tree, and he was more comfortable dealing with the generation above him, his father, his grandfather, his great grandfather.
Yeah.
And I've heard that that is quite common. That people like me are just like, let's get into everything. But some people like to go so far as long as it's sort of above them in the family tree. They don't want to get too close to their own generation. But I totally understand that obsessive sense of wanting to dig further, further, further. And Solomon Farthing has that instinct. And that's why he's a good air hunter. Because sometimes it's not about what you can find by getting the right algorithm or the right combination of your search engine. It's about what you understand about people and what they try and hide and what they try and cover up and what records are really saying. It appears, everyone thinks paper is all the truth, but most birth certificates, I've got birth certificates that say this cannot be taken as proof of identity, a birth certificate, because they also can be very slippery, what's written on them.
Yeah. When doing the thing for the soldiers, because of course now it's over 100 years since the end of the First World War, and the camaraderie and that. How was it doing the research for that? Because it's very, very emotive, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, like I said, what I tried to do first was, well, after sort of panicking, what I did was I tried to build them up as characters in their own right and think about, therefore, what they would do as a character in the situation they're in, just so people understand. What I have is I have this group of 10 men, and then an 11th comes along, and they've been separated from their company at the very end of the war because they've been sent ahead to wait for the rest of the company to join them, and they've taken made camp, if you like, in an old farmhouse with a barn and etc. And there's a river a sort of mile or so away, and it's this question of whether the orders are going to arrive for them to attack across the river, and they're waiting for these orders to arrive or for the end of the war to come. So what I did was I tried to think of who these young men were in terms of their innate characteristics, in terms of their personality. Then what I did was I started to read a lot of classic World War I fiction and poetry as well. So I reread Pat Barker's trilogy, the Regeneration trilogy. I I'm sure any of you who've read that will agree it's just really masterful around war and the impact of war on everybody, not just men who have to go to war, but the people left behind as well. She's written. I've read a lot of her books actually, and she writes brilliantly. I think she's our sort of absolute mistress of writing about war and its aftermath, certainly contemporary. I read classics like All Quiet on the Western Front, things like that, just to sort of get. Fiction's brilliant for getting yourself in the sense of a mindset of a place, of a time, of characters. How might they feel about things? And then what I did was I had to give them something to do. I realized quite quickly that soldiering, even during the First World War, which we think of as about the battles, the Somme, etc., sitting in your trench, going over the top, actually a lot of war is sitting around, waiting, doing repetitive tasks of digging or fixing the latrines or getting supplies or whatever it is. Then there's playing games. There was quite a lot of camaraderie. Quite a lot of men enjoyed getting the chance to go to war. It was a change from their everyday lives. They thought it would be adventure. So I tried to bring all of those elements into it as well. And then because it's about money and how it passes hands over time, I looked at what money would have meant to men in that situation and this idea of how they pass money around. And of course, in the book, they don't really have money. Money is not important. Other stuff is important. And then what they do with that stuff is they gamble. They play games because that's what soldiers did when they were waiting.
Yeah, I must admit the car games and the chickens was definitely my favourite.
Yeah, I loved writing that game of chicken. For those quite early on, the men they're in this farmhouse and there's chickens there, and they play games with the chickens, gamble over the chickens, which chicken's going to survive, And it's both a literal game they play and a metaphor, of course. And I really enjoyed writing that. That really helped me actually to get the character of the men, who would do what, who would gamble everything and who would not, who would play and who would not. For whom is it just a game, and for whom is it actually something more than that?
There's a lot of deep characters in there. Which would you say is your favourite character of the 10?
Oh, that's so hard to say. I mean, I I do have a real soft spot for Jackdaw and Promise. These are my two A4 boys. So these are two young men who are 18, and they're called A4 boys because that was the name of the draft that they came into the war in, and so they've grown up with the war, and it's still going on when they come to 18, and rather than waiting to 19 before they get sent to the front, they get shoved into it straight away. And because they joined kind of spring 1918, when there was this huge push by the other side against the Allies, the British and other allies, and honestly, the Allies thought they were going to lose the war at that point. Bent so far back, we were going to break. That's how one of them describes it. And so these two young boys have been thrown straight into that and had a huge amount of fighting. And then suddenly, the end, 6 months later, it looks like actually they might win and the end's coming. And so they've seen these incredible and been part of these very profound experience at a very young age. And so I really wanted to look at them, and one of them in particular, and what happens to them. I mean, what must it be like if you're like 18, 19 and you have what probably is the most profound experience of your life at that young age, and yet then you maybe live on to be 70 or 80, etc. So I have a real soft spot for them. I do. Beach is the ghost in the novel, and he's a ghost who lives with me too.
Yeah,
I can't say anything else about him, can I? It gives too much away.
Absolutely gives too much away. If you wouldn't mind reading a few questions for us off the side, please, Pete.
Yeah, of course. Right, let's see what we've got in the way of questions then. If such a delicate subject, light about the war, did it feel like a lot of pressure to get it right?
We've got someone's asking, if it's such a delicate subject to write about the war, did you feel pressured to get it right?
Yes, is the answer to that. Yes, I really, really honestly believed that when the book was published, people would say to me at events or just send me messages or in reviews or readers' comments, whatever, oh, you've got this wrong and you've got that wrong, and this is completely would never happen. And actually, that hasn't happened. And I was really pleased, and it's not because I have got everything absolutely accurate. It's because what I've tried to do is foreground the characters. So what matters is that you feel it's believable in the world that I've created. But I did do quite a lot of. I did try and pay attention to certain, certain things, certain structures in the army, and certain details, for example, things like the cap badge and some of the language they use, the song that they sing at one point, the idea of the rules in the army, if you behave a certain way, etc., etc. I tried to understand those, but also I was trying to subvert them slightly, because my men were subverting them slightly by being slightly outside of place and time while still being part of the army. So I suppose I was trying to kind of have my cake and eat it to a certain extent. But yes, I felt huge pressure. I was quite worried actually about the 11th person who comes along as a young man, and he brings a dog with him, a little dog who sort of haunts the narrative too. And I was quite worried about that. I thought, would this really happen? And then I went to visit Alnwick Castle, to the Fusiliers Museum, because my young boy is a Fusilier from Northumberland. And the first thing I saw on walking into the museum was a little stuffed dog, exact like a real dog that had been stuffed. And I read the detail, and it said this was their mascot, and it went to war with them, and it got shot in 1916, and they stuffed it, and now they have it as their mascot in the museum. And I just thought, that's really weird. That's like my novel.
Of
So yes.
course, stuffed animals are quite relevant to your universe, because I think they had a big role in the first book too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I have a stuffed stoat. When I was writing The Other Mrs. Walker, I had a stuffed stoat on my wall, and so I let it feature in the book as well.
Is there a time period on the wall for?
We're being asked, is there a time period, an event that you wish you'd been a fly on the wall for?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think that's why I write historical narratives. I think I definitely have this idea of what would it be like to have been there. And I think also, don't you think everybody asks themselves this question, particularly with things like Remembrance Sunday? What would I do? How would I behave?
Yeah.
To me, I think about that a lot. Would I have been someone who signed up to be a nurse on the front, for example, or to drive an ambulance in the Second World War? Or would I have stayed at home and looked after my parents? Or would I have just gone on with life like a lot of people did, doing whatever I was doing, etc.? If I'd lived through the era of the sort of radical suffragettes, would I have been someone who chained myself to railings, or threw eggs at protests, or tried to blow up cricket pavilions, etc.? All the kind of things they did. I think we all believe that we would be at the forefront of history somehow, that we would be acting in the way that we see, but actually probably most of us would just be at home doing the washing up, listening to the radio, reading novels, and going to work like normal, I think. But yeah, I would love to be a fly on the wall of all the historical eras that I write about, which tend to be cross 20th century. That seems to be my sort of area that I most enjoy writing about.
Final question. What advice would you give to a new writer to get published, or do you advocate becoming an indie writer?
We're being asked, what advice would you give to any new writers looking to get published, or would you advocate becoming an indie writer?
Well, I said before, if you're a writer and you're looking to get published, and of course you can get published many different ways nowadays, I would say that's great. I would say keep that goal in mind and imagine that can happen for you, because it can. But also don't worry too much about that outcome, if you like, if you haven't finished writing your thing, whatever your thing is, whether it's short stories or whether it's a novel or a screenplay, poetry collection, whatever it is you're writing. You have to do that first and keep going with that. you have to have creative ideas that are going to drive you forward, because it's up to you. You know, this the kind of world, it's a wonderful world, and it can be a very supportive world, and there'll be lots of other people out there, or in groups like this, etc., who not only love to read but also write for themselves. And I would say it's really important to be part of that world. Find your little network of people who can support you and be interested in what you're doing outside of being published, because it just helps you keep going, and it's fun, it's good, and you get lots of good ideas and support, etc., whether that's one other person or 10 other people or whatever it is. But write what you want to write. Have your idea and stick with your characters, and go, why am I following them? What's the story I want to tell? And keep going with that. And eventually you'll discover you have your own unique style and your own unique take on that particular story and those particular characters. And just, you know, stick with that. Don't worry about what other people are doing. I think if you're writing a novel, I would definitely say get to the end. It took me a long time to learn that lesson. And in fact, I still haven't really learned that lesson. I always tend to write too much of early stuff and go round and round and round that without actually just pushing to the end and then going back. Once you push to the end of something, it's just so much better, because you go, right, okay, the whole territory's laid out now. Even if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. You go, okay, well, that didn't work, I'll do something else. But you've reached an end. So before you go for publication, think about those things. Then once you want to go for publication, you need to be looking, I would say, at kind of other writers and where you feel you've got any kind of symbiotic sense with them. Is it the style in which they write? Is it the subject matter in which they write, etc.? And look for who publishes them, to see which kind of publishers might be the right ones for you. But it's such an individual journey. It's weird. I mean, there's loads of advice out there about how to write the right sort of pitch letters and how to approach agents and how to approach publishers, etc. But it's also quite tricky. It's quite an individual thing, and the right person will come along for you at the right time if you keep going, if you keep persisting. And I mean, in some ways, I'm talking about traditional publishing, which is how I'm published by one of the big 5 publishing companies. But you can also self-publish, obviously, as massive nowadays, and might well suit you. So think personality-wise as well. What's going to suit me? What kind of publishing journey do I want to have?
If we can end on what's coming next for you, then.
Well, what's coming next is I'm writing, or well, I'm supposed to be finishing. Let's just say I'm still writing a 3rd novel that's part of this world, No Next of Kin. So Mrs. Walker's about who gets you to your funeral if you die with no apparent next of kin. Solomon Farthing's all about who chases your money, as we talked about. And this one is all about who cleans up after you. So it features a cleaner and also a police officer who actually appears in Solomon Farthing as a sort of minor character, but in the next one she takes centre stage. And of course, as in all my books, that's what they're doing in the contemporary world, and they're looking into the case of an old lady who's died in a house, and she was a hoarder, so they have to sort the house out. But really, the real question of the book is what's happened in the past for those characters and for the old lady. I won't say any more, because like all my books, the real crimes in them are in the past, and you have to dig into them to discover where the really bad stuff lies.
I'm definitely going to have to give that one a look, because the so unique. Because I think I've only ever read one similar one, that was Sarah Ward's In Bitter Chill. Have you read that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's probably our time now. Thank you so much for this afternoon.
That's okay. I'm just going to finish by showing you something which I thought you might find interesting, given the subject. The first thing is this. Can you see this? If I put it here.
I can now. Yeah.
This is a little photograph. Well, I can't put it in front of my camera.
Yeah.
This is a little photograph of my great uncle, and he went to the First World War, and he sent back all these incredible letters. And when I was writing the novel, I never knew anything about them. And then my mum said, "Oh, we've got a box in the attic." So anyone out there who's writing anything historical, ask your relatives. They might have a box in the attic that is exactly the right thing. And the last thing my mum gave me was this, which is what's called a Deadman's penny. And this was a plaque which was given to anyone who had had a relative who had died in the First World War. And again, I wrote a whole book about the First World War and only discovered this, which was my great-grandfather's after the event. And so it's amazing what you can dig up in the attic. But on Remembrance Sunday, I remember my great-great-grandfather, and I'm sure lots of people out there are remembering their relatives as well, who either did come back and had many stories to tell, or those who had stories to tell but didn't come back. So you'll have to tell the story for them.
What a lovely way to end on that. Yeah, definitely thinking about all our relatives over today. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alex. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.